everyone, and welcome to our service this evening. And we do thank the ladies for the splendid soup and rolls. I have been having some soup and rolls in the church for the past few weeks, and I must say that tonight's one is very special indeed. And this afternoon we were at Ruth's house for the newcomers' lunch, so I'm pretty full up for this evening, but it's full down here but not up here, so that's why I came to get myself filled up in the brain and maybe to do some juggling with my theology. But I'm here this evening. I'm privileged that Ken has asked me to introduce the bishop. Some of you may have known that Bishop Richard was made Assistant Bishop of Canberra and Goulburn from 1994 to 2000. And in the year 2000, he came back to the Diocese of Auckland and served as the Dean of the Cathedral from 2000 to 2007. And I think in between those years, I remember that Bishop Richard was also Vicar of Henderson, where Ken was the Methodist minister at Henderson as well. So our paths do cross somehow. And he's always there in our midst. And I do remember too that at one time when Bishop John Patterson was away for his sabbatical, Bishop Richard became the Vicar General. So he is building up himself. And in the year 2000 to 2001, he was a member of the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification. Now, how good can you get? He seems to have a foot in everything. And in 2004, in recognition of all the things that he's been doing, he was made the companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Now, that says something, isn't it? We do have a bishop of great caliber among us this evening. Among the many different books that Bishop have written, the first one was on Christian ethics and the New Zealand economy. The second one, Hearts and Minds, a place for people in a market economy. Then the third one, A Word in Season, reflections on spirituality, faith, and ethics. And most recently, you know that he wrote another book, Slipping the Moorings. And I know that we do have a copy in the library, but it's never there at all. And I've been asking Gwen, who got it this time? So there must be something about this book that's keeping that book occupied. I hope people won't tear off the pages when I do get that copy. There must be something there about that book. I met Bishop Richard when I was in the Diocese of Auckland, and during that short period of time, I've come to know him a little bit. And I met him one day at a gathering at Epsom for clergy. And after the talk or whatever it was, I can't remember, I remember speaking to Bishop Richard in the car park. And he gave me a few words of advice, and I've took it in me. Like Bishop Richard, we don't seem to be the favorite among different sides of the church. We tend to get into a little bit of complications, and people are quite suspicious about our theological positions. But then, as Bishop reminded me this evening, we must be doing something right then. So, without much further ado, we do want to listen to Bishop Richard this evening. I'm sure after this morning's sermon, you're fed up of me already. So, Bishop Richard, it's your turn. Thank you. By the way, it is, a little bird just told me, it is Bishop Richard's birthday today. So, do we sing happy birthday? Is that in order? Let's sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bishop. Happy birthday to you.
Yes, 21. Thank you very much to you for that, and to all for your welcome and happy birthday song. In actual fact, there are 3 Anglican bishops in New Zealand who have birthdays today. Apart from myself, there's Murray Mills and Jim White, the Assistant Bishop of Auckland. And also the recently retired Bishop of New Hampshire, Gene Robinson. So I haven't heard from him, but the rest of us keep in touch, which is nice. And thank you to Ken for setting this up, and others who have helped with the publicity and with the lovely soup tonight. Thank you very much for that. I enjoyed it. Is the microphone on all right? It is, okay. All right. Well, I know there was about 3 or 4 topics advertised for tonight. I think what I want to do is to talk first about God and then about the poverty and inequality. And I've got a set of PowerPoint slides here for when we get to that one. There were 1 or 2 other things advertised, like same-sex marriages and the future of the church. You know, when we get to the discussion, you can ask me about those rather than my giving a little spiel. I'd rather get to the discussion first, but feel free on those issues. And I also want to say, and I've said this in my book, when I was the assistant bishop in Canberra, it was a diocese that went from Canberra, the centre, it went east to the southern coast of New South Wales and places like Merimbula and Eden and Bateman's Bay, those of you who know the coast, and went west as far as Wagga Wagga and north to Goulburn, where the cathedral was, which pre-existed before Canberra was formed, and south to the Snowy Mountains. So it was a really nice diocese to be part of, nothing more than 3 hours drive, which in an Australian diocese is quite something. And I went one Saturday morning down to Maruya, which is one of the parishes on the east coast. And I was running a seminar, and I said, no, anyone want to say anything? And nobody did. I thought, this is a worry. So it was morning tea time. We went out for morning tea, and I was walking out behind 2 of the women who were at the seminar, and I overheard one of them saying to the other, we don't have to agree with him, you know, just because he's a bishop. And that is so true. That is absolutely true. The bishops don't have the quintessence of knowledge, an answer to everything. And there's room in the church for a variety of viewpoints. So in talking today first about God, I'm going to offer some thoughts which may be familiar to some of you. They may be strange to some of you. They may be perhaps new, or I hope they're not upsetting, but they might be. I just want to say it's important that each one of us has our own experience of God. So to be able to hold on to the things which we experience of God, that is very important. And the way we speak about God and the images of God are going to be different. Some will work for some will work for others. So don't feel that what I'm saying tonight is the orthodox and final truth on the subject. If it raises some thoughts and we can discuss it, that'd be great. And at the end of the day, we can go away saying, well, that was a load of old cobblers, what he was on about. I know what I think. And that's okay to do that. All right. And I do remember and love the editorial of a science journal that had the editorial disclaimer at the beginning. The fact that any point of view is expressed in this journal doesn't mean that it is endorsed by the editor, nor even necessarily understood by him. So there's my theological disclaimer at the start of the evening. Now, I've thought a lot about God over the years. We all have. And when I was a curate in Papakura 50 years ago, I wrote an article. I don't know if anyone remembers Church and People. It was the Anglican magazine, which died a long time ago now. And I clipped out an article I wrote, I think it was called Faith Without the Supernatural. I thought, gosh, was I thinking that even 50 years ago? But there it was. And I got a phone call one morning from a crusty old curate in the parish next door in Manarewa, a guy called Bob Hattaway. He was a great priest. but he could be a bit grumpy. And the phone went, and I picked it up, and he said, "Bob Hattaway." Oh, good, yeah, I'm going to get it now. He said, "That was a mighty fine article you had in Church and People. I just want to commend you on it." I thought, "Oh, okay." It obviously touched something. And I think some of our thinking about God today is something we need to consider. And while I'm very concerned about this, is because I feel there are so many images of God out in the community today, many of which I'd have to describe as being caricatures. But it's all that many people know. The caricatures that are out there, old-fashioned, simplistic, fundamentalist ideas. And a lot of people, I feel, are put off what the church really stands for because they don't know what we really think. They just have these images, and oh, that's a load of rot. No wonder I'm not part of the church. And I think it's getting worse because fewer and fewer people are in charge of the church, in touch with the church. And then you get Richard Dawkins. Now, I don't know if any of you have read The God Delusion. It was good. And it's a thick book. And I read it in a day because Kim Hill wanted to interview me about it or something. And Richard Dawkins, he uses an analogy of God. He talks about, the analogy is the analogy of a celestial teapot. Now, he says, imagine, and it's not his idea, it was actually Bertrand Russell who came up with this brilliant insight about God as this like to a celestial teapot. He said, imagine that somewhere in orbit between Earth and Mars, there's a celestial teapot going around. Now, you can't see it, it's far too small to see it, so you can't say there isn't, but who in their right mind would actually believe there is? You see, he uses that kind of simplistic sort of caricature to really say, no, that's what God's like. It's just like a celestial teapot. Can't prove there's no God, but what intelligent person today would think there actually was? And while I respect Dawkins as a scientist, I don't respect his academic integrity in terms of the way he talks about God. Because all he talks about is that kind of extreme caricature, which is not difficult to knock over as a credible thesis. And having knocked it over, he then says, so obviously the only answer is atheism. And there's a whole lot of stuff in the middle today, Celtic concepts of God, and God as mystery and otherness that are there, which he never canvasses. And I think to actually have credibility as an academic and to ignore the major part of what he's talking about, of what the language is about God today, is it's unforgivable, I think. And Lloyd Gearing, I have a lot of respect for Lloyd Gearing. Lloyd's 96, and he lives in Wellington. I go to have coffee with Lloyd from time to time, and he's a lovely guy. I used to worship at St. Peter's when I was vicar there in Willis Street in the 80s. And so we chat, and I actually put him in the same category as Richard Dawkins, not because he's the same type of person as Dawkins, but because the bones of his argument are the same. It's either here a full-on supernaturalist traditional view of God, or it is nothing. And I think that both Dawkins and Gearing, I've called it a theological bipolar disorder, because they either here or there, all the stuff that's in the middle. And Dawkins knows about it. He does know about it because in his book, The God Delusion, he talks about how there was a proposal to introduce the doctrine, I'll call it, of creationism into the science curriculum of a state school up in Newcastle in England. And this is rubbish to think of creationism as a scientific theory, although many do, and insist it be taught along with other scientific theories like the Big Bang and theories of the beginning of the world. And Dawkins decided to get some scientists together to write a letter of complaint to Tony Blair, saying that this is not right, that this should be happening in education circles. And by the way, he said, I'll I'll talk to my friend Richard Harries, who was the Bishop of Oxford at the time. And he can line up a bevy of bishops. And so here we were at about 9 scientists and 9 bishops writing together, complaining to Tony Blair about this proposal. And there's a little footnote at the bottom in Dawkins' book where he says, I'm deeply grateful to Bishop Richard Harries, who has drafted this letter for us. Now, you see, he knows very well that there's a whole corpus of theology about God, which so many people in the church don't buy into, that simplistic disorder, bipolar disorder, but it's totally ignored by anything that Dawkins has ever written. And I think academically he's culpable. I mean, I just don't feel any academic with integrity can write in that kind of way. And the sad thing, and this I think is a very sad thing, is that so many people in society today don't have the ability to critique that. They don't have the knowledge of different ways of thinking about God. And because of that, they say, oh, well, okay, I'm listening to an expert. Dawkins has said so, and he's an intelligent man. This must be right. I'd always thought anyhow there wasn't anything really solid about Christianity and God and things. So now, with great assurance, I can let it all go and I can float off as a free-floating humanist or atheist, call it what you like. And that really worries me. And this is why I've wanted to raise these kinds of questions, because at the end of the day, I think it's a question of evangelism. You know, the way we proclaim the faith in terms that people can understand and say, well, that makes sense. And it's quite different to some of the things I thought the church was on about now that you've set it out in a way. So in what I've written, and it's all in chapter 11 of Slipping the Moorings, I've contrasted being with a being. Now that's really the essence of what I want to say tonight. Whether we think of God as a being, in the traditional sense of a supernatural, divine figure who created the world, who keeps the world going, who listens and answers prayers and intervenes to do something or not do something when we think he ought to, my goodness. Now, that is the traditional view, and it's what is known as classical theism. So it's the classical and traditional theistic view of God. So when I talk about theism, I'm not just talking about any believing in God, I'm talking about this particular view of God, the one we've all grown up with and the one we all know. Now, if you talk about, that's God as a being, but if you talk about God as being, you're talking about something quite different, because being, it's more to do with existence, with mystery. We're not packing it into clearly defined words or creeds or images or pictures, but we are actually having a broader concept of what it's about. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but the problem with God as a being, there are 4 problems, as I see it, and as I think a lot of people in the community see it too. I think this is why many people don't consider Christianity, because of one or more of these 4 reasons. The first one is that we don't think anymore as a community in terms of a 3-decker universe, you know, like heaven, earth, hell, and the whole panoply is filled with gods and spirits and demons and angels and messengers flying here and there, and people going up here when they die and down to the devil if they've been faithless in their life at the end. Now, that there's a whole imagery there. There's a lot of symbolism in it, which I think we can rescue. But by and large, if people think, you know, this 3-decker concept of the universe is not something I buy into, and therefore I can't accept no Christian faith because of that. I think that's a barrier for people. Second barrier is anthropomorphism. You know the word anthropos means human. Morphe, morphism is shape. Human-shaped concept of God. That, as Lloyd Gearing says, and I don't disagree with him on everything, but we have a tendency to create God in our own image. So what do we know of beings? We know that they're very much like us. You know that they are intelligent, caring, thinking, communicating sort of people. All these best qualities that we know, we'll sort of promote them into a super being that has all these human-type qualities and the ability to act, to intervene, to listen, to speak, that this is the image. Now that's an anthropomorphic image of God. And a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, 2,500 years ago called Xenophanes, he likened this in one of his writings. I won't read out the whole, excuse me, the whole quote, but essentially what it was saying, that if the horses wanted a god, they'd choose a horse because it was the only thing they knew. And as I put in my book, but it wouldn't be any old nag that whinnies and wheezes and sort of gets sick and frail and dies. Now, this would be a real super horse that was perpetually young, perpetually energetic, perpetually something to look up to that gave us hope, and this kind of super horse. Now, he was having a go then, you see, 2,500 years ago, about anthropomorphism and the way we tend to create God in our own images. And I think that that is another problem. Then I think the third one is that it's the problem of evil. Now, you've all know this problem. Now, why is there such a tragedy in my family that my 30-year-old child is dying of cancer? Why did God send the tsunami in Asia those years ago, or in Japan more recently? Or why didn't God stop those things happening? Now, if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and all-loving, then how can an all-loving God who has the power allow those sorts of things to happen or doesn't intervene to stop them? Now, there have been endless theodicies, they're called, written, trying to explain that conundrum. And I've never seen one that I find satisfying. Very complex and very deeply thought into, but never at the end of the day does a penny drop for me in trying to explain that conundrum. But the point is, we only have that problem because if we have a theistic view of God whom we endow with these superhuman type qualities, someone who has the capacity to do this or stop that, therefore, it's a problem that a lot of people think, how could I believe in a God who allows these dreadful things to happen in the world? And the fourth problem is the whole thing about science and religion and creation. Now, you know that there are traditional arguments between religions and scientists. And they become far more into view in the last couple of hundred years. Think of Charles Darwin. He sailed out to the Galapagos. He came to New Zealand in 1835, called it the Bay of Islands. Now, questioning the whole thing about creation on the basis that, the evolution, origins of species, they've actually shown that the whole thing that's evolved over many years. Then we get Stephen Hawking and others with the Big Bang Theory. And the little bits about what God does is what they call God of the gaps. The gap gradually gets shifted, but there's always the argument that God must have had something to do with the start-up of the world. It's gone now to be intelligent design. There are all sorts of concepts. But you see, I'm not sure that Christianity actually has to have a theory about how the world was started. Christianity is about something else. It's about how we live in the world, and how we have faith in God, which I'll come on to again in a minute. It's how we care and love. And the whole story in Genesis 1, the creation story, as I'm sure you've had explained to you many times, is it not science? It's not history. It's a wonderful story that talks about the wholeness of the earth, about the gift of earth, about all creation being one, and from that, all our mission of justice and compassion and environmental concern flow from that very powerful story, not a theory about how the world started whenever it did. And I often compare that with the Maori legends or myths about Rangi and Papa, the earth and the sky and how it all began. And we had a Maori woman, Martha, with us this morning at Morrinsville, and I asked her, have you ever heard people talking about the myth of Rangi and Papa as a scientific theory of the creation of the world? She's never. And I never have. I doubt if you ever have, because they don't see it as a scientific account. It's something which is powerful because of very similar messages which I've just described about what the creation story is. So I think the reason we have this argument about religion and science all the time is because of the theistic view of God, that God must have pre-existed and had something to do with it all, and we'll try to find out what that was and create a theory that will be able to hold the line for a little bit longer. So those four reasons in why I think there are a lot of problems with the theistic image in the minds of many people today. And I think as a church we have to be able to give a credible account of our faith so that people have a good idea of Christianity and not a caricatured one. Now, when you talk about God as being, the Old Testament lesson this morning at Morrinsville was Moses, Exodus chapter 3, Moses minding his father-in-law's sheep on the slopes of Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. It must be exciting minding your father-in-law's sheep all day on the slopes of Mount Horeb. But on this particular day, he heard a voice calling to him, Moses. And he turned aside, and as you know, there he encountered this bush that was burning. It was on fire. And the voice was coming from out of the bush. And God was calling Moses. And Moses goes over to see it. And God calls Moses to go and deliver his people from Egypt and to bring them forth into a land flowing with milk and honey. And that's how Moses got on the case, fighting with Pharaoh and getting them all out across the Red Sea. And Moses said, now, who shall I tell them is calling me? And the very enigmatic answer from the bush, tell them, I am has called you. I am who I am. It's the Hebrew word Yahweh. You see, when you talk about I am, it's really a statement about existence, about being is what I'm reading. It's the same root word, am and be, all part of the same verb. It's not defined, it's simply an otherness which is there and calling Moses. And for me, when I think about God as being, it's in that sense of an otherness, a mystery. It's not just human beings writ large. There is a dimension of life, a spirit of love, which actually is calling us and relating to us. And I think of God as being in that kind of category, because it works for me. It doesn't have to work for you. Let me just say that again. But I'm just saying that we're talking about images and perceptions here. I took a funeral once for a friend of ours who was an atheist. And before he died, he called me in and said, look, I'd be glad if you could do the funeral, but I don't want any religious talk, because I'm not a religious man. He said, I'm an atheist. And I said, well, okay, look, I always take a funeral with a sense of the integrity of the person who's being buried. But tell me, what do you believe? I asked him. And he said, I don't believe in God, you know, but I do have a sense of being part of something bigger than myself. And I thought, wow. Because I'd pretty much be in that category as a starting point. A sense of something other than us that communicates with us, that holds us and keeps us together. Or what do you make today of what's happening at Anzac Day? How many people go to Anzac Day services today and they come away saying, there was something there that caught me up. And, I really felt there was a spirit there. I can't quite define what it was. But again, I think it's a universal human experience that in different ways we experience another dimension of life. And that to me is when I talk about God as being, I'm thinking about being in that sense of a mystery which is other than us, but we actually relate to it. And having had that experience, or continuing to have those experiences, and you can think what your experiences are of otherness, come in so many different ways, we then have to think of the language with which we describe it to others. So we've got an essential experience. Now we've got to find a language to describe it, or an image to describe it, to try and convey something of this essential experience we have to other people. And so we create words and creeds and liturgies and rituals, and theologians argue endlessly over them. And we have images, and one of their powerful images, the traditional one, the image of classical theism, as I've described. And note now that the question is something quite different. Instead of a question about what is your core experience of God in that sense of otherness or spirit, the question is now, do you or do you not believe in the existence of a supernatural being? Now that's the celestial teapot type of argument, you see. And how can you possibly tell whether you believe in the existence of a supernatural being? What we believe is what we felt. As Moses felt a call, as it changes our lives and sends us out, to care for other people, to work for justice and peace and environment, all those sorts of things. See, it's a fundamental shift. And people say, I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic in relationship to the existence of the image. Now, I think that's a fundamental problem. We're asking people to think up in their mind whether they can give intellectual assent to the existence of something rather than helping them say, what is your core experience of what lies at the heart of life? Now, there are some people, of course, and I respect this, who say, well, it's not just an image at all. It's actually the real thing. And if you don't believe that image of a theistic God is core doctrine, they would say, if you don't believe in that, then you don't have a faith at all. Now, I respect people for whom that image is something that still works, and it does for many people. Many of you here tonight, I don't have any problem with that image. That's absolutely fine. But I think there's a huge and growing number of people outside the church who do have a problem with that image for all the reasons I've mentioned. And we need to be able to give a credible account of our faith in 21st century terms so that people can say, that makes sense. I can see now what you're on about, and it's not so crazy. So that's what I want to leave with you on the first part of first leg of the journey tonight, some thoughts about God. And so many of those images in the middle that I mentioned between the two bipolar disorderings, Celtic images, which you know, and of faith and love and spirit and compassion and otherness and transcendence. And just one last thing. Do I pray? I do pray. I don't actually feel I'm praying to a person or a being. I feel that what I'm doing is releasing myself into the spirit of being, of mystery. Oh, another thing, of course, to say that the mystery is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, because mystery can be rather confusing by itself. But if we see the nature of the mystery in the person of Jesus Christ, then we have some clear guidelines on what to run with. And I have this rather paradoxical view, is that when I pray or meditate or keep silence or reflect, I have a sense that it's a very personal experience. Now, I do feel personally engaged. Rowan Williams said he feels he's being attended to, which I think is a marvellous way of putting it. But because it's a personal experience, I don't necessarily feel there has to be a person in a traditional sense on the other side of the equation. It's what one person has described. Maybe it's a transpersonal experience that you're having. So those are the things that we can talk about in a minute. How are we going? No, not too bad. So now, are you happy just to hold that for the moment, or has somebody got some urgent questions they'd like to ask now and get them, or make a comment now? Yes.
I've only just thought of this.
Yes.
Some people, perhaps you think that, perhaps if some people and you think that, there's a being, and, well then, how can we, what about Jesus? Did he come from the being? Is he the Son of God, the man or lady up there, or is he the Son of the being?
Son of being. Not son of a being, but son of being.
Yeah, but that's very...
Yeah, you have to do some reinterpreting about that, and I've gone into that a little bit in chapter 11 in the book, that, for me, some of the very powerful words are in John 6:68, where Jesus said to the disciples, "Will you too go away?" When people were falling away from Jesus. And they said, "Lord, to whom else can we go? Because you have the words of eternal life." And to me, I think it's that discernment that in the person of Jesus, everything that is essential about the heart of life is to be found. So we look to Jesus as a unique person who reveals the nature of the mystery that we follow as Christian people. No, see, that Gearing, well, he was a great prophet, of course, but Gearing says that because he doesn't believe in God as either being or a being, he feels all there is human. You can't have someone who's a son of nothing. And so he relegates Jesus then to the role of a prophet, as you say, or a sage. They're part of the wisdom tradition, lots of great men and some great women too, who actually have said some marvellous things in life, and Jesus is up there with the best of them, but there's no uniqueness in the sense of son of being or a being. So we do need to rethink a little bit of those things. It is tricky. I don't know. I really don't. But I do want to say it is important that you hold to the things that you and each of us here have found, because I don't want to take away any person's own personal experience or the way in which they frame things. And if something works for you in terms of coming closer to God, however we understand God, and coming closer to Jesus and being disciples of Jesus, that's the thing that really matters. And I think the images and the words we use, I liken them to signposts. The signs that point the road, Hamilton. Now, we never confuse a signpost with the city. We know there's a reality to which the signpost points. And all our words and our pictures are only helpful insofar as they point us and take us to the experience of God and the person of Jesus Christ. And so you can have different types of signposts, different images, and I think the ones that work for you may not be the ones that work for me or for others. We have to have confidence, I think, in our own experience and not feel because others might have different images that therefore there's something wrong with ours. So I'd really want you to hold on to what works for you and is meaningful for you and for each of us. there are different views in the church. And I'm concerned, as I said at the beginning, for many people outside for whom the traditional images and signposts don't do very much at all. In fact, often they're a turn-off. How can we speak to them in a way that might help them to go on that journey of faith and discipleship? All right, well, shall we have a change of scene then to something quite different? Leg 2 of the double. And then we'll have time. Hold any questions you've got now. And as I say, we don't have to agree with him just because he's a bishop. I think that's a very wise counsel. So remember that. So one of the things, as some of you know, I used to be the social justice officer for the Anglican Church from 1990 to 1994. In the days following Rogernomics, but into euthanasia, as they used to call it, and and those very dire times when our whole understanding of values as a society and the way we deliver them was being debated. And this is just about 10 slides here now, they're quite quick, about inequality, because there's been a huge increase of inequality in New Zealand in the last 30 years. And so there's the title. Oh, I've pressed something wrong. What have I done? Oh. Well, I've turned it off now. Oh. Oh. Obviously a sign. Let me try this one. There we go. How many have read this book or heard of this book? Yeah. It's a great book, isn't it? Written by 2 British researchers. You can see their names, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Came out about 2009, so it's 7 years old now, but not a lot has changed in that time. And look at the subtitle in blue, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. Okay. Whoa, we've gone back. No? Oh, I'm going to go back to the machine. Now, read across the top. It says, how much richer are the richest 20% in society compared with the poorest 20%? Now, that means if you take the average income of people in the top 20% of society, how much more is it than the average income of the bottom 20% in society? And what this chart measures is the factor of difference. So if you look at the very top, you probably won't be able to read it. You see Japan. Now, across the bottom of the chart, this is the factor up to 10 of 10 times the bottom equals the top. In Japan, it says if you follow the end of their bar at the top, it comes down here to about just over 3, doesn't it? What that's really saying is that in Japan, the top 20% average income is just over 3 times the bottom 20%. And if you look at the bottom to Singapore, look at that, they're just about up to 10. What that's saying that in Singapore, the average income of the top 20% in society is almost 10 times what the 20% at the bottom get. And up near the top, clustered, as you might expect, you see Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and then Belgium and Austria, then Germany. But now the Scandinavian countries, as we rather know, are much better in equality in society. The gap between top and bottom is not as great in Scandinavian countries and Japan as it is in other countries. Now, can you see where New Zealand is? You can see it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 up from the bottom. 6th worst out of these countries. And if you follow it along to here and you bring it down, you can see it's almost 7 times what the top get as compared with the bottom. And it didn't always used to be like that. In the 1980s, before we got into Rogernomics, there was a much more equal society, and we've dropped over 30 years. Now the politicians say, yes, but we haven't dropped in the last 5 years, we've been stable. And I think that's probably true. But the thing is, where we are now is hugely different from where we were 30 years ago. 7 times. Now the gap there at the top. Now, here's the thing that goes with this, because this is what makes it even more interesting. Now, if you look at this chart, it says that health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. Now, on the left, you can see that list. There are index of various socio-economic indicators. Life expectancy, maths and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, including drugs and alcohol, addiction, social mobility. That's the capacity for people to, rise up in society. I don't mean in terms of revolution. I mean in terms of what happens. Now, along the bottom, you now have the income inequality. And what Pickett and Wilkinson have found, that the higher the inequality, the worse those countries do in terms of those socio-economic indicators. And so on the left hand, the vertical axis, the higher you up on the vertical axis, the worse you are doing in terms of socio-economic outcomes for society. And to the right, the higher the inequality is. So look at the trend line that goes there. And so down the bottom again, we have Japan and Sweden and Norway and Finland, all there with better, quite good social outcomes comparatively, and quite low inequality. Look at New Zealand. You see we're way up here. We know we're along the high inequality spectrum, and we're not doing all that well in terms of what we deliver to our community in terms of socio-economic outcomes. And up there too, look at where USA is, right up at the top pretty much on both bad and very unequal. I didn't actually see where USA came in on the inequality chart, the bar graph. Did anyone notice that? Second to last? Yeah. Okay. Well, there you see it there. Now, these are just a few quite quick ones that actually give some more. Child well-being is better in more equal rich countries, so better now is at the top on the left, high inequality on the right is again, and again, look where New Zealand comes in, and we know that, don't we, from what we're reading and hearing in the media, etc. Drug use is more common in more unequal countries. Now there's New Zealand, you see over at the top on the right. High drug use and high inequality. And there's Australia and UK, and look where the USA is again way out there in the extremes. Prevalence of mental illness is higher in more unequal rich countries. And again, you can see New Zealand focusing there, and one of the places we shouldn't be at all. Infant mortality rates. Again, you can see us there, top right. I believe these have improved slightly in the last 2 or 3 years, but still not good. Rates of imprisonment. Well, I think last I heard New Zealand we have one of the highest rates of imprisonment in the Western world. Second only, I think, to the United States, that imprisons 600 of every 10,000 people. maybe it's 100,000 people, I think, actually. 600 are in jail. In New Zealand, it's about 200. Well, there you can see the figures on the right. Yes, it's per 100,000 in terms of population. So New Zealand comes in, we're showing there, I think, just above 150, aren't we? But the prison muster is going up. It's just about to hit 10,000, and it costs 100,000 a year for each person we keep in jail. What's 10,000 times $100? Does that come to $1 billion, or is it more than that? But it's a whack of a lot of money, and the private prisons rubbing their hands because they make good profits out of this. You see, and the private prison runners are very keen on locking people up and getting more people in jail because they can build prisons and make money. Fancy making profit out of incarceration. But that's part of the sadness of the corporate world we live in today. Now to ask the question, why this inequality? They did a survey in America, and they asked people, what would you feel was an average income to live on? What would be a satisfactory income? How much would your family need to live on and feel reasonably comfortable? And let's suppose the answer was 70,000. So you'd be happy with that? Yep, you certainly would. What if you knew that most of the people in your neighbourhood were actually earning 80 or 90,000 or 100? Would you be happy then? No, we certainly wouldn't. Because what that survey in America revealed is that income satisfaction, it's not just actually having enough to live on, it's actually knowing that what you've got is more than a heck of a lot of other people, because there's a status to it. You know, I've got a 6-figure or today's 7-figure salary, so it does a lot for my ego if I can know that I'm ahead of the pack. It's what we know as a win-lose ethos. I can only be satisfied if I'm winning, if I know that other people are losing. And I think that has a lot to do with the socioeconomic policy sets which we have in New Zealand. By contrast, more equal societies operate on a win-win strategy, because the national ethos is one of family, togetherness, of the common good, of the well-being of all of society, not just me and my mates. Now that's the way we think is quite important here. Now neoliberalism, we've often heard of it. It's based on things like enterprise, freedom, reward, deregulation, low taxes, low welfare. And these lie at the heart of the changes that came in from Roger Douglas's time on, to move to a different way. And I'd be the first to admit that there are a lot of inefficiencies in old systems. There's no value in being inefficient. We've got to make good stewardship of the limited resources that we've got, and that enterprise and freedom, creativity are good things in the life of an economy. But what it has to be tempered by are what St. Paul says at the second dot point. He emphasises that the use of our gifts and talents are for the common good, so that we do these things not just for what we get out of them, but because we know in some way we're making a contribution to the well-being of the whole. And you remember the late Roger Kerr of the New Zealand Business Roundtable. He didn't like what the churches were saying in the 1990s about the directions the country was going in. As he said, the churches were undermining the program by being perpetrators of corrosive myths. I really love, he had a great gift with words, Roger Kerr, and to be labelled as perpetrators of corrosive myths because we talked about justice and well-being and those sorts of things. I thought that was a real sign of success, that it was actually getting to the business community, and the church was having a witness here. We're almost finished. And at that time in 1993, the church leaders put this statement out suggesting 5 principles, actually 6, because the treaty was there too. But you can read them: human dignity, solidarity with others, interdependence, seeking the well-being of all, valuing work and creativity, priority to the needs of the poor, and being mindful of the Treaty of Waitangi. And those are the values I believe that we stand for as disciples of Jesus Christ, and that when we think of evangelism, we need not just to think of personal evangelism and recruiting people into the church and discipleship. I think we have an evangelistic role in challenging the whole mindset of society and beginning to move more in this direction. Just one final thought. Some of you may know the name of Max Rashbrook, editor of a book 3 years ago called Inequality. I listened to him speak in Wellington near the end of last year, and he said, so many people in this country are aware of the poverty because the statistics are in their face all the time. And they don't mind a little bit of tinkering around the edges to throw out a few crumbs here and there. But they will never be into radical change in New Zealand socio-economic policies because there are two fundamental values that they can't shake off. And one is that we shouldn't be helping solo parents. We won't really want to stick it to the solo parents who haven't got married and like any responsible person would. And to the unemployed, we don't want to be encouraging idleness by giving out too generous unemployment benefits. And what Max is saying, and he's a very reputable person, is that that's what they are discovering, that it's not that people don't care about the poor, but if the answer is ramping up things that are going to make a difference in health and housing and education and all those kinds of things, they don't want to go there. Partly because of the ideological blocks, partly because it might mean they have to shell out a little bit more in terms of taxes. And the nation is fixated on tax cuts, not bigger expenditure. Expenditure has to be well targeted, of course it does. But I do like what Bill English is saying at present, to see how serious he is. He's talking about social investment, and some of you will have followed this debate. What he's actually saying is that we need to be investing money now at the front end while people are young, so that they're living in warm houses that are not overcrowded, that they're getting good health care, they're getting good education, so that they can actually advance and not reach a stage 15 or more years later where they become drug addicts, doing crime and all those sorts of things. That a preventative input now is going to be hugely beneficial in the social benefits that we will reap at a later date. Now, for me, that's quite a new way of thinking, certainly in this country. I think usually we just thought in terms of 3-year terms, got to save the budget, get it right this year, show we're in the black. Let's not worry of what we might be spending 12 or 15 years down the track because we didn't fix it now. That's the kind of thinking which I think is progressive and something we ought to be encouraging more. I hope it's an idea that catches on. So look, I'm going to stop at this tour. I think we're going till 7:30 if we need to. There are other things I could talk about, but I think I've talked far too long. So please say anything you think, and remember that I don't have the final word on anything. So your thoughts and experiences are very important. So please feel free to saying let's get a good dialogue and debate. Ken's got a microphone there if anyone wants to use it and to speak. Yeah.
Thank you, Bishop Randerson. Just a couple of thoughts on the social economic situation. My understanding is that at present the government is spending $12 million a day on interest payments. And of course that all comes from private banks creating the money out of nothing. That would go a long way, $12 million a day. The other thing, in this last budget there was $300 million extra going into the military. We know about the Northland forests dying for lack of money to dock. As far as the environment goes, that $300 million could maybe even use the same people. That's the real war we've got going on in New Zealand at present. So, and I think it's all part of our Christian responsibility.
Yeah, good comment. Good comment.
Hi Richard, I wonder if you've seen any examples or know of factors that might contribute to societies moving from a win-lose kind of ethos to a win-win ethos?
Yeah. Well, I just think it's the straight result of neoliberalism and and what's happened over the last 30 years, the emphasis on reward and the ramping up of salaries at the top end, whole lot of, and then that leads to policies like the 0 hours contract. No, that didn't go through, mercifully, but what they got is not much better. But now this is one of the issues, the end of the 40-40 work ethos. That's 40 hours a week for 40 years of your life. That's all up for grabs, and I think there's a concerted effort to keep costs down, even if it means people become unemployed, to move legislation in favour of employers and profits so that the people who are shunted out of the workforce lose out. I think also the very low minimum wage we have now, it's good. Do you have any living wage efforts here in Hamilton? I'm sure there must be, to pay people not a minimum wage of about $15, but a living wage of about 19 or more in the dollar. So I think that repression of working class people and very miserly attitudes to payouts. I mean, there are some good things. There was $25 last year per week to beneficiaries, but there are a few clawbacks as well in terms of other things that they lost. So I think that kind of policy has engendered more of a sense of how am I doing rather than how are we doing as a community. And while that might perhaps seem a bit vague, I think the neoliberal policies are very much built on, or the consequences are very much win-lose consequences rather than win-win. So, yeah. Okay.
I just want to say that we do blame the politicians, Roger Douglas and Ruth Richardson, for a lot of this, and some of that's deserved. But I think we underestimate the extent to which the whole Western world has lost manufacturing industry, partly through technology and partly through the export of jobs to Asia, which is really unstoppable and is actually accelerating.
Yep.
And I don't think that's something that we can do a lot about.
No.
I've read Rushbrook's book, and I've tried to read Thomas Piketty's book, who's quoted a lot. And I find their setting out of the problem extremely good. Piketty's statistics and so on are excellent, but those authors really don't seem to give us a lot of leads as to where we might go. And I do endorse what you're saying about the minimum wage. I think that politicians in the past have said New Zealand should not be a low-wage economy. Well, I do think they need to put to take some action on that and raise the minimum wages, because there is a substantial part of the workforce in New Zealand now that's not unionised and basically works on minimum wages, and which we didn't have. 30 years ago, the bulk of the workforce was unionised, and the minimum wage was just for the odds and bits and pieces. It's now a substantial part, and I think that's very important, that the minimum wage should be raised. And I think in this very low inflationary environment is the really great opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Over here somewhere.
Yes, my question is partly a statement and partly a question.
Good. We don't just have
It seems to me that we have a problem with reference to your comment about blockages that we have in our thinking. We have a problem when it comes to thinking both logically and with equal justice across the society. So we argue on the one hand that superannuation payments have to be indexed and at a particular level because that's the minimum that older people can live on, but we fail to take that thinking across the board. And I cannot see any logical reason why all other benefits shouldn't also be indexed. And certainly it becomes a kind of justice issue that we need to find some ways to get past those blockages in order to ensure that we get back to a greater equality for those who are dependent in the society.
Yes, thank you, Bishop, for what you've shared tonight. I have read that book, Inequality, some years back, and it certainly resonated with me. Those countries that you had on the graph that perform very well and are more economically and socially equal, they have a high level of tax to help run that country. And of course, our current thinking is to try and reduce tax. So we're not going down a good track, and there are plenty of ways to help with the taxation. They refuse to touch liquor, which is costing the country a lot of money and health. They're happy to crank up the cigarette price, but liquor they won't touch, and that could be a good start.
There's a lot of sacred cows, aren't there, that we don't want to touch in case it upsets people.
Well, but scared to change the subject, but you did mention the fact that you might be prepared to comment on same-sex marriages, because I find the position of the Anglican Church very disappointing in this particular area, and you know, some people have suggested to me that it's due to block voting by an ethnic group within our church. I'm just wondering to know what is the position and what is the thinking?
Well, that's a very good question. The General Synod, which meets every 2 years, met in Napier 2 weeks ago, and there was a proposal before the General Synod to allow 2 orders of service for the blessing of a couple who had had a civil marriage. So they've been married civilly, same-sex couple, or heterosexual couples can have a civil marriage if they want. In fact, many of them are today. If you're not being married in the church, you'll have a civil marriage, male or female, or same-sex. And what the church wanted to do was to allow for the blessing of a service. It's not the blessing of a service, it's the blessing of a couple who have contracted a civil marriage of whatever nature. It leaves unchanged the fact that marriage in the Anglican Church's view is something between a male and a female. Now, some would question that too, but it's very much a sacred cow, that one. So they decided not to go down that track, so that stays. And so what the General Synod had to decide, are we in favour of an order of service which may be used to bless a couple who have contracted a civil marriage? And one was for those if it was a heterosexual marriage, and one was for those who'd entered in a same-sex marriage. There's only one line different in the order of service that were proposed by a working group. Now, Tikanga Polynesia are very happy to go along with it. Now, they don't have civil marriages in any of the Pacific nations, so it's not something that will apply to them. Maori, they were prepared to go along with it too. So the 2 so-called ethnic, but the 2 indigenous populations were saying, we're happy to run with this because we think this is important to Tikanga Pākehā very much, and to the others, of course. But in Tikanga Pākehā, there was a real division that principally the Diocese of Christchurch and Nelson were not prepared to run with the blessing of a couple who'd contracted a civil marriage. They believe it is a matter of core doctrine. So it's not just something you can have different views on and still be part of the same church. It's something that's either right or wrong. See, the question of the ordination of women 30, almost 40 years ago now, was a matter where at the end of the day, Lambeth in 1978 recommended that different provinces of the church could do what they thought was right. And we're at the head of the pack, of course, here in New Zealand. Diocese of Sydney and many in Africa still won't have women priests, but that's okay. Different practices were approved as being okay. What the opponents of this proposal is that different practices are not okay. Even if it's not happening in our diocese, we don't want to be part of a church that is doing something which in our mind is totally wrong and contrary to what the Bible says. There's a lot of debate about what the Bible says, as you know. And that was the thing that the two dioceses, principally Christchurch and Nelson, said, this will cause us so much pain, and we feel we'd have to walk away from the church, some of us, if this went through. And Maori and Pacific, I remember there was a delegate from Polynesia who said, we have heard the pain of our Pākehā brothers and sisters in some parts of the church, and we don't want to cause pain. We don't want to move the bus until everybody is on board. So the thing was deferred for 2 years, and there'll be a little bit more tweaking of it. I'm not sure myself that in 2 years there's going to be a change in attitude. And I think at the end of the day, while consensus and consultation is a very good thing in the Three Tikanga Church, I don't believe that consensus is the same as we must be unanimous. And I think that if there's a conviction, I mean, there's no doubt that if the motion had been put to the vote, it would have gone through. Yeah, with quite a substantial majority. Now, I don't know, but I think that might happen next time when the General Synod meets. And the two things that I feel is that, you know, we have a great preoccupation with the unity of the church. And I think unity is a precious thing, as the psalm says. But if unity means really peace at any price, and we'll never do anything if it's going to upset anybody, no matter how just it is, we won't do it, then I think that's a false kind of unity. It's a suppression of ideas. And what we need to remember also is a question of unity with whom? You know, unity with the most powerful minority group in the church, or unity, you know, with all the gay, lesbian people, not only in the church, but in the community at large. To me, that is a wider unity, which our mission calls us to. It's not just keeping a nice peacefulness within the ecclesiastical machine while we exclude other people. So, sorry, I hope that's not too long an answer, but the other two tikanga were in favour.
But doesn't that just show that some parts of the Anglican Church believe in the theist God? Because I'm sure the being and the spiritual thing that you're talking about couldn't care less.
Well, yeah. Yes. Well, a being. Yes. Well, I think you might find it difficult to draw that conclusion, because I feel there are many who have a sense of God as a being, who would feel that in terms of relationships, same-sex. Yeah, well, I haven't done a survey, and I'd be surprised if you have, but I know there'd be a lot of people in the church who'd be in favour of a same-sex relationship who would very much believe in the traditional theistic image. And I certainly don't accept that belief in God as being means that we go down a slippery, sliding slope where anything's okay. I mean, that's not my view. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think there are some texts in the Bible about homosexuality, and some of them are quite fierce, but I think the two things that have changed since the Bible we're reading, I mean, I think what was written, I mean, what Paul was writing about in Romans 1, I think was excessive immoral behaviour, and he runs through a list of a whole lot of them, as you know, in Romans 1. And homosexuality is mentioned there, but also, heterosexual relationships, which I think not judgmenting that, but just saying that abusive relationships, exploitative relationships are the thing that we're talking about. The two things that have changed in the 2,000 years are first, the fact that we now have a concept of permanent, lifelong relationships between two people of the same sex. All our 3 children have gay godfathers. We didn't know any of them were gay at the time we asked them. We asked them because they were Christians, and that's what we wanted to be, as godfathers. One of them has been living for 30 years in a relationship with his partner. He's a card-carrying member of his local Anglican church. He's very much involved, and he is a true believer, this person. And so I don't think the Bible is actually writing about permanent same-sex relationships. And the other thing that's changed is that we have a different concept today about homosexuality. It's not just, although some people still have this view, it's not just a sin, that these are evil people, they're sinners, are getting off in. It's just that people are wired that way. Some people, genetically, this is their orientation. And it's no more realistic to say to them, you cannot have a relationship with someone of the same sex, that it would be to say to some of others of us here today, who are heterosexual, doesn't matter if that's your orientation, you can't do it because it's been forbidden. Well, it hasn't been forbidden, of course, but we are forbidden on this side of the fence. And I think we need to be able to interpret Scripture within the context of the world we live in today and the knowledge of the world we live in today, and think through what are the fundamentals. See, what was the thing about women? Paul's very clear about women. They should keep quiet in church. They should go home, ask their husbands for the answers on things, because the husbands would certainly know and be able to put them right, you see, and inform them. That's very clear. I think the texts about male headship are far more clearer than the texts about same-sex relationships. But you see, the wider principle in the Scripture is a principle of equality, that in Christ there is neither male nor female, neither slave nor free, neither Jew nor Gentile. So that while there are some specific texts, when they're examined in the context of a broader understanding of the context and the fundamentals of Scripture, we actually see, we need to run with those fundamentals, not with what some particular text might happen to say. Do any of you men have wives who keep quiet in church and ask you when you got home what was going on? My wife's always told me what was going on, so otherwise I wouldn't have gone as far as I have in the church, I'm sure, which is not very far. So I think, good question. No, thank you for that. Yes.
On the question of marriage,
Yes.
2 or 3 years ago, a colleague and I put up a resolution to a secular organisation that all marriages should be required to be with the registrar in the first instance.
Yes.
My colleague had been married in Germany, where it's the law that you get married in a registry office.
Yep.
You then go to your church if you wish, or you do whatever you like. And of course Prince Charles had done the same thing for different reasons. Well, the reaction to this was extraordinary. All these young people who had been wanting their rights over this, that and the other were appalled that they wouldn't be able to go into a church to get married. My guess is that none of them would anyway.
Yeah.
But the mere thought that the option of going to church to get married was going to be somehow subvertive by going to a registry office first was beyond belief, really, I thought. So it's wider than the church.
Yes. I mean, the churches I think it was in the 1960s or 1970, supported the concept of marriage celebrants because it didn't feel that a lot of people, if the only option was standing on the lino in the registry office to hear a few words spoken by a clerk, that it didn't really measure up to a full-on ceremony at the church, and it was not a right choice for people to have to make. And I know as a priest, that I just didn't feel all that good reading all those words out of a book, knowing that the couple in front of me didn't buy a bar of it. You just felt you were doing something. So I think what you did was a good thing to do. Not the only solution, but I think it was a good proposal.
But the opposition
Yes. Yeah. Oh, good on you for trying. I think that's very... It's better to be knocked down for having a go than not having a go, which I think too often we do. Jock, hello.
Bishop, yes, I think the first thing is an observation that you made about the inordinate amount of stress there was on the unity of the church. I would have thought that sex was another pretty close second.
Yes.
What I would like to ask you about, and that is two things. One, how do you understand that when we say God has no hands but our hands?
Yep.
And the second thing is the earth is the Lord's and all that therein is. And how do you... I noticed that climate change and those sort of things do not appear to be any part of that, and I think that is rather an omission.
Climate change, yes. So I would have encompassed that under environment as what? Is that what you're asking? Is climate change an issue? Clearly, yeah, because we are given, responsibility. This is part of our discipleship, to be stewards of God's creation, and which means preserving it for the generations yet to come, our children, grandchildren, and countless generations. It's part, I think, of what Genesis calls us to be good stewards of God's creation. Yeah. Is that getting at what you're saying? Not quite. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yes, it does. No. Well, I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah. And is it not, we're talking at tea at our table about Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, and they seem to be tapping into a growing discontent or anger with the establishment and corporate powers and business. Remember the Occupy movement 4 or 5 years ago now. And I think people are feeling frustrated, they're feeling powerless, and there could well be a continuing revolution and challenge. And I'm glad for the people in this country who are putting, their mouth out there, speaking. And I quite agree with you that the church needs to be doing more. One of the things I'm very sad about is that my position as the Social Justice Commissioner has been discontinued in the church. They're replacing it now, or proposing to, with a little network of people who can write public statements for the archbishops to put out. Well, you know, I think statements by the archbishops are not bad things. I've made a few statements in my life myself. But you don't want to imagine that this is all of a sudden going to turn the whole thing upside down. You know, we need work going on at the grassroots. And, you know, I keep looking at the Salvation Army, at Campbell Roberts and his successor now. You know, the only continuing audible voice for justice coming out of New Zealand Christian circles. And we need to put some money, and the money we're going to put into the Social Justice Secretary, who'll coordinate some statements from time to time when the archbishops want one. I calculated that it's less than 1% of the money that goes out from the St John's College Trust each year. Now, to the tikanga you divide, is going to be $14.5 million next year going out from the St John's College Trust. And just over half of that goes out to the tikanga, the 3 tikanga for ministry officers and other type appointments. And if you take that over 0.5%, it's just about 8 million of the total. And I calculated that if a secretary coordinating statements in an office for the archbishops, suppose it costs $70,000 a year for the office and his salary or something, that just under 1% of that total distribution to the 3 tikanga. Maori get 60% of it. Pākehā get 32% of it. And I think Polynesia gets 5 or 6 or something like that. And I personally think, how can we be serious about our social justice work if we're putting less than 1% into the issues that you've touched on? I think it's a disgrace. I've written to them. Haven't had a reply.
I just wanted to follow up on what Jock raised with respect to the planet and the way we're looking after it and the way the church is looking after it.
Yeah.
For a long time, I think the church was preoccupied with thinking that our reward was in heaven. We could ignore what we did with the planet. And in fact, I heard a notable in the church recently say the only reason they stayed in the church was their reward in the afterlife. I think we've got beyond that. I think we now realise that the kingdom of God is here, and what we do with it turns it into heaven or hell. Yeah. What's your feeling about this?
Oh, look, I'm thoroughly on board, and Revelation 21, you know, the kingdom, we saw the heavenly city coming down out of heaven to earth. Not the earth, the faithful ones going up into the ether, but the heavenly city coming down and taking root here. It's a recap of the Genesis story, you know, that as it was in the beginning, so it will be in the end, this perfect kingdom of wholeness and oneness and justice and peace and love. And you ask the question, what is the end that you're working to? Now, the word end in English has 2 meanings. You can see it as a termination, a winding up, the end, destruction, the earth has come to an end. But we also use it, and this I think is the better meaning, in terms of a goal or a purpose. What is your end? And I think our end is to build that heavenly city that encompasses the whole of the earth, creation and all peoples and creatures within it. That's a great end for us to be working for as part of our mission. There's a lovely story about a Presbyterian church in America who was choosing a pastor, and they wanted to have someone who was going to be a fiery damnation preacher. And so they were interviewing one candidate and said, you know, are you a millenarian then? Well, you all know, of course, that a millenarian is someone who believes that we're living in the last days, that the end is coming any time soon, and therefore preaching fire from the pulpit is going to be their call, and this is what they wanted. And this guy said, "No, I'm not a millenarian." He said, well, you're a pre-millenarian then. It hasn't come yet to the last days. No, it wasn't one of those. Surely not a post-millenarian, and it's happened and we missed it. No, he didn't believe that either. He said, I'm actually a pan-millenarian. And they'd never heard of a pan-millenarian before, and said, what's that? He said, well, we pan-millenarians believe that as long as you don't get too uptight about it, everything will pan out all right in the end. Yes, he didn't get the job, that guy. Yeah.
Well, Ken's going to put the jug on.
Good.
That must mean something.
Yes.
Richard, it's my privilege to thank you for a delightful evening, but also to welcome a number of faces here that we haven't seen, and it's wonderful to have people from other church communities and the general population, I think, coming here to occasions like this. And this, by the way, is one of a monthly evening, Sunday evening that we have. We call it progressive. We keep on wondering whether that's the right word.
Great word.
Because it
Great
has
word.
implications, a pejorative implication that there are regressives as well as progressives, etc.
Aggressives.
And we don't quite like that. But nonetheless, we have a group of people who meet here who chew the fat and think about the issues that you've raised today. And I love the title of your book, and I've been thinking about that and wondering why you said slipping. Slipping the moorings and for those who have boats will understand what slipping the moorings means. It's not cutting, it's not loosening, it's slipping, right? Did you really mean that? Was that?
I did.
Yes?
Yep.
Yes, slipping the moorings. It's a wonderful little parable, isn't it? Slipping the moorings. Because many of us have been moored in our childhood in the doctrines of the church, which have held us in place, locked us, concreted us in. And slipping the moorings has been tremendously difficult for us. And it's wonderful to have someone from the church hierarchy thinking that slipping the moorings is not too bad.
That's a great thing.
Yeah. But it's wonderful for me to think that this gentleman here is 6 months exactly younger than I am, and when he entered the room, the average age of the group here dropped a little.
Not much.
And we should wonder, where are our children? Are they still moored somewhere? Or have they slipped, or have they cut the moorings long since?
Long since.
Yes, it's an interesting little thing to think about, isn't it? But Richard, you've touched us all, and we're all on this journey. And as you've said so warmly, we don't have to believe everything you say.
No, absolutely right.
And we're all on that journey. And some of us are right up there with you, and some of us are wondering, some of us are slipping, and some of us might even be cutting.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful evening, and there's a cup of tea coming up.
All right.
And I've got a little envelope for you. This always happens,
Oh,
doesn't it? The little
outrageous.
envelope.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's just the title, Slipping the Moorings. Those of you who have read the book, you read the appendix at the end. And it's a parable. I preached at the last diocesan synod in Canberra, Goulburn. And it's the only sermon I've ever preached that people stood up and clapped. You don't clap sermons. But it's a parable of a ship. It's called the Ecclesia. So you got the meaning originally, the Ecclesia, you see. And a beautiful old ship, very comfortable, tied up at the docks, very busy on board, but it just never goes anywhere. So what the parable and what the whole book is about, how can we slip the moorings and move out onto a whole range of issues, many of which we've talked about tonight. So it's a great read, and I'm certainly happy to sign a copy, anyone who wants one. Thank you so much for participating in the discussion.